Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our Hard Histories book talk with Dr. Mia Bay. My name is Kendra Grissom. I am a second-year PhD student in the Department of History here at Johns Hopkins University. Launched in fall 2020, the Hard Histories at Hopkins project examines the role that racism and discrimination have played at Johns Hopkins. Blending research, teaching, public engagement, and the creative arts, Hard Histories aims to engage our broadest communities at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore in a frank and informed exploration of the myths that have become part of our university story and to offer evidence of how race and racism have shaped Johns Hopkins. In fall 2021, we are hosting a series of scholarly conversations exploring the histories of Blackness, slavery, and racism in the Maryland area. Today, we are excited to host the fourth such discussion. We are honored to have with us for our conversation Dr. Mia Bay and her book, Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance, which came out from Harvard University Press in 2021. In this book, Bay traces discrimination against Black people as they sought to move throughout the United States from the 19th century to the present. Bay demonstrates that the struggle for Black freedom was not only waged at lunch counters and picket lines and in courtrooms, but that the struggle also took place on steamships, airplanes, and in automobiles and stagecoaches. Traveling Black centers Black people's persistent efforts to fight transportation inequity. Maryland, a key intersection point for transit of all kinds, was and continues to be a critical site for this history. Dr. Mia Bay is the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History at University of Pennsylvania. Prior to arriving at Penn in January 2018, Bay worked at Rutgers University, where she was a professor of history and the director of Rutgers Center for Race and Ethnicity. Bay is a scholar of American and African American intellectual, cultural, and social history, whose publications include Traveling Black, The White Image in the Black Mind, African American Ideas About White People, and To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Addie B. Wells, just to name a few. Bay is currently a Patrick Henry Writing Fellow at the Starr Center for the Study of American Experience at Washington College, where she is working on a book on the history of African American ideas about Thomas Jefferson. Dr. Bay will be in conversation with Hard Histories Project Director, Dr. Martha S. Jones. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor of History, as well as a professor of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Bay and Dr. Jones will be in conversation for about 25 minutes, and then we'll turn to your questions. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function. Finally, live captioning is available directly through Zoom. For those who prefer to access captions online, we are posting the link in the chat. Thank you both for being here. I will turn the conversation over to Dr. Jones and see you all at the end of the discussion.
Thanks very much, Kendra. And this is a great opportunity for me to thank you for all that you've done to contribute to the work of the lab this semester. And I'm thrilled to say that Kendra is going to stay on with us for the spring term here at the lab in collaboration with Dr. Kim Gallen, who will run the lab in the spring term. So we're just thrilled to have you with us and to have you continue in this work. So thank you so much. And we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Bay. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Martha Jones. And as Kendra said, there is such an important connection between Dr. Bay's work in Traveling Black and some of the work that we've done here in the Hard Histories lab over the last year. In particular, back in the spring of 2021, Ariella Shua, one of our lab members, worked specifically on understanding better the evolution, the emergence, the instantiation of segregation in public transportation here in Baltimore City in the wake of the Civil War. Ariella looked at a cluster of very important lawsuits brought by Black Baltimoreans who were looking to challenge, to use new federal legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, to challenge segregation on the B&O Railroad, on local trains and streetcars. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Bay here to help us understand better some of what we've discovered and to put it in the context of this epic story that she has told. So welcome back to Johns Hopkins, Dr. Bay. And our tradition is to offer you some moments just to set up the book, and then we will have a conversation. So thanks so much for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this great invitation and great introduction, Kendra. So yeah, I'll just briefly introduce the book. It's a study of the intertwined history of travel, segregation, and Black struggles for freedom of movement. And it's organized around successive forms of transportation. It was a sort of project that really came out of curiosity. You know, I in writing about Ida B. Wells, I realized that her experience of being kicked out of a lady's car on a train in the 1880s was a moment that really sort of galvanized her political activism. And it made me think about how these forms of transportation segregation were taking shape at very specific moments. It wasn't like they had always existed, and how people resisted them. And I wanted to know more about how that happened as different forms of transportation developed, because we don't really think about the way that the history of segregation coincides with the transportation revolution. It coincides with the kind of emergence of modern consumer culture, and they're all linked together. So that's what the book tries to reconstruct around particular forms of transportation, which all develop their own kind of distinctive patterns because they're different forms of transportation. So you would sit, you know, the colored car, the Jim Crow car would be at the front of the train, but you would sit at the back of the bus. There was certain kind of segregation that took place on airplanes that was different still, and there were very specific problems that people encountered, things like cars. So the book traces all of that while also tracing this continuous struggle against it, which is very much, Maryland is a central player in that. The Baltimore African-American has a lot of journalists who are publicizing things. There's some very important court cases. And, you know, Maryland, along with Virginia, they're kind of at the crossroads. So they become places for real battles over
these things. We have thought a lot in different ways about the B&O Railroad in particular, in part because it is men here in Baltimore are responsible for bringing that into being and managing it. We've spent some time in the Garrett papers looking at some of how the B&O Railroad evolved. We know that Mr. Hopkins is part of the sort of superstructure of the B&O Railroad. But I think what we knew less was the ways in which for Black Baltimoreans, the railroad is really becomes, particularly after the war, a kind of site, a location, and a kind of symbol, right, for and a testing ground, right, for what now it means to have abolished slavery, what it now means to have affirmed Black citizenship, what it means to have passed the Civil Rights Act. And the railroad turns out to be that place where it gets tested. My first question really is a dive in, because while we found that there were Black Baltimoreans who were educators, lawyers who come to Baltimore precisely to have these kind of encounters on the railroad and then to see if new federal legislation will permit them to push back against separation on the railroads. But we have others who are reluctant, right? Members of the community who really are not sure that litigation and confrontation are the ways to go. And I wondered if you could help us just think about sort of how among Black Americans in your story, is there more than one party line? In other words, is everybody on board for the kind of challenges to segregation, or are there debates about how to grapple with that?
I think there's definitely debates, and there's different constituencies. There's, for instance, for some working class Americans, it didn't always matter. They didn't travel as much. in the early days of transportation segregation, sometimes the sort of in the Jim Crow car was in fact the half fare car. So the people fighting for access to the white car would be people who actually could afford the white car. So there's that. And then there's a lot of differences over strategy. I mean, do you want to take it to court, or do you want to actually do civil disobedience? And then beyond that, there's questions of prioritization. How important is travel segregation among the many terrible things that African Americans face? And that will be throughout the thing. Like the NAACP will be very important to the desegregation of transportation, but it will be often kind of sort of reluctant. I mean, the NAACP is dealing with lynching, it's dealing with education segregation. It often has to be a little bit, it's not always first on the agenda. So I think there's so many different reasons people had to be ambivalent about it.
Yeah. So now let me pull back because I want to understand better your choice to do this book in a kind of epic way. Right? That you oftentimes historical studies, you could have done this study by flunking down in Baltimore,
right?
And telling the story across time through one place, but instead you decide to tell this story really in a kind of epic form. And I wonder how you come to decide to do it in that way. What makes it possible to do it like that?
I think it turns out it took the shape it did because the way I researched this book was by following people as they traveled. I followed, I wanted to know what it was like to travel at various times on various forms of transportation. So I found memoirs, newspaper cases, newspaper reports, court cases, things where people actually recounted a journey. And in doing so, I ended up following them the way that people actually travel. Like when we travel, we decide whether we're going to take the bus, drive a car, or, take an airplane. So we always experience travel as a continuum of choices, which is one of the themes of the book. It's like there's a sort of active discussion among African Americans, which form of transportation is worse at a given point, or which form of transportation is giving them new hope. And then, of course, when we travel, we cross state barriers. And the biggest, I would contend that the biggest issue around transportation for African Americans was always long distance travel. Not only because long distance travel is simply more problematic when it's uncomfortable for anyone at any time. I mean, if you've ever sat in a bad plane seat or in a loud bus, you know that feeling like I'm here for like 8 hours, I'm gonna die, I can't stand it. But also because some of the more quotidian daily forms of segregation on things like streetcars and local transit, they could either be avoided or people would get kind of used to them. The problem with segregation on long distance transportation is that it varied from place to place. People didn't know what to expect. They often didn't know that they might have to change car, or that they wouldn't be able to buy food, or that the restrooms were for whites only. So it was kind of impossible to navigate in ways that local forms of transportation segregation were not. So I needed to capture that all across the broad scope in which people actually experienced it.
So are there characters that sort of stuck with you, or that, kind of opened the door for you to this kind of following of the story?
Yes, I mean, so many African Americans from throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century have these sort of travel experiences that they recount, or many of them, and some people who were particularly active. There are a lot of them are people we know. I mean, Frederick Douglass routinely got into brawls when he was asked to move to the Jim Crow car. Dr. John Rock, that abolitionist, used to be thrown off stagecoaches. Ida B. Wells became a journalist after being thrown off the ladies' car. And then you have someone like Booker T. Washington, who seems accommodationist, but he was also really opposed to traveling Jim Crow. Going into the 20th century, William Pickens of the NAACP, you could probably publish an entire book of just essays in which Pickens is outraged by various Jim Crow experiences. W.B. Du Bois became a passionate car driver because he hated traveling Jim Crow. So that you said that there's a variety of different people who sort of carry the story. And over the course of a long life, they'll often comment on different forms of transportation.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that, one of the sort of common sense ideas that folks might bring to the book is that segregation in transportation is a Southern question. Mm-hmm. And so can you say a little bit more about the geography?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, that was something I was really thinking about because, you know, I thought, is this a book about traveling Jim Crow or traveling Black? But what I found in terms of actually following people on their journeys is that segregation was not Southern. I mean, there was certain forms of legally supported segregation, such as the Jim Crow car, which was supported by laws that required the railroads to keep people in separate but equal cars. But even something like the Jim Crow car was never limited to the South. They would sometimes put people in the Jim Crow car as far north as Chicago and as far west as Los Angeles. And other forms of segregation, like not being able to stay at hotels or eat at restaurants, were pervasive in the North as well as the South. So segregation was never limited to the South. So the book ends up being about the entire country, though the South is the battleground where segregation is finally successfully challenged.
You know that not so long ago, I published a book about Black women in politics and voting rights.
Right.
And one of the biggest surprises for me was the degree to which nearly every woman I wrote about, whether it's in her memoirs or in her correspondence, in her, you know, record of lawsuits, you know, Ida Wells, and her truth, but nearly every woman I wrote about had a story about being, you know, moved out of her seat, roughed up, ejected. And so I guess, and because I was writing about women, I didn't really have a comparison, if you will. So I wonder, is there a gender dimension to this story in your mind? Or you're saying, you know, Douglas and John Rock, or in a sense, having experiences that might be analogous to the ones I discovered the women in Vanguard were enduring.
But no, I think there is a gender dimension. You know, one of the things that travel develops around is it creates a kind of new form of interior space, which is often a kind of domestic space. Like the first class cars on the trains look like living rooms. They had curtains and sofas, and they were for women. They were, you know, this kind of, they were sort of invented as the ladies' car first. And then they would have very specific kind of amenities for women, like bathrooms that are for women only. And for women, being excluded from these things was a very gendered thing because it was an assault. It wasn't just sort of inferior comfort. It was often a kind of assault on your respectability. Like, as a respectable woman, you didn't want to use this unisex bathroom in the Jim Crow car. You know, and you didn't want to have to sit in a car with like smoking white men, which would sometimes, you know, white men would come into the Jim Crow car to smoke. And that could be like genuinely, it was in fact often genuinely kind of alarming to women. So there was some sense among both women and men that Jim Crow was even harder on women because they had none of the kind of protections afforded to white women. And also it was very insulting to women, like that. There would be like ladies' waiting rooms in train stations that had no Black woman's waiting room. There was a ladies' waiting room and there was a colored waiting room. So the implication was, you are not a lady.
Yeah. You know, and I remember most vividly from the memoirs of Mary Church Terrell, of an experience in which she finds herself alone in a car, and the fear of sexual assault.
Right.
That was a kind of vulnerability that came from being isolated in cars and traveling overnight. And this, I thought, was in a sense distinct from the way in which men were experiencing the same journeys.
Absolutely, and there was a kind of history of we think of the color car as being a place where only the Black people were, but white men would often go into them to smoke and also to sort of prey on whatever women they found there. So it was very alarming, and for that reason, when the cars come along, a lot of men start driving their wives everywhere, or once women start driving more, women will prefer cars over trains.
So thinking about cars, it leads me to think about the Green Book, which I think is another kind of touchstone that many readers will bring to this book. But when does the Green Book become sort of part of the story? It's not always there. It's not always part of how Black Americans navigate the world.
No, and I mean, one of the things about the Green Book is that people should keep in mind is it's only one of many similar guidebooks. The first one is actually something called Hackley's and Harrison, that starts just before the Depression and doesn't really survive. The Depression shuts down travel. There's the Travel Guide, there's the Go Guide, there's Grayson's Guide. And they all kind of get going. Really, the sort of golden age of guidebooks sort of starts after World War II. But they are a genre that begins earlier than that. They kind of take roots in this kind of list that jazz musicians kept that would sort of circulate around places like New York City, or even in the 19th century, the Liberators sometimes published lists of which railroads would accommodate people. And it's good to see that there's been recent attention to them and people are sort of finally remembering the Green Book, but I think it's important to remember the whole spectrum and also to remember the limitations of things like the Green Book. The Green Book, was something that was not always up to date, and the places that it listed were never kind of adequate to the travel needs of Black travelers. There were many, if you go through the Green Book carefully, you'll see there's many places where there are no accommodations, and then people who use the Green Book would complain that some of the accommodations that you would end up at were actually quite terrible.
I'm thinking about Rosa Parks. How could I not in this conversation? But I think what I wanted to ask you is, in a sense, where does the story end? And before I do that, I'm just going to remind folks, the Q&A box is open. So by all means, drop your questions there. I'll be getting to those in just a few minutes. So I think that there's a lot of mythology around Mrs. Parks in that moment. But what I want to ask you is, I think one of the myths is that that's where the story ends, right? With the successful boycott in Montgomery and the breaking of segregated transportation. But your book doesn't end with Rosa Parks, and maybe you could say more about how it does end, or if it has an end.
If it has an end. Well, I would say on the one hand, from Rosa Parks through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which sort of, brings the end of those colored and white signs, brings a kind of decisive end to certain kinds of segregation. There was a tremendous victory that we should not discount in terms of creating a kind of new world of travel in which there are no longer colored hotels, colored cars, all these things. But on the other hand, if we look at transportation equity, we are still very much in an unequal world. And what essentially happened, and it's sort of what I discuss in the epilogue of my book, is that, just as the transportation is desegregated, we are in a moment where we are moving towards a complete car culture. So we now no longer have segregation on trains and buses and other common carriers, but we also don't have very many trains or buses. There's many areas that are not served by the bus. We have only one real passenger railroad line, Amtrak, which doesn't travel very many places. We have a car-dependent culture, and there, African Americans still lag behind whites, African Americans, and Hispanics in terms of car ownership. They also confront Black and brown people confront sort of high expenses and all sorts of difficulties as drivers. So we are now in an area where mobility, and a moment when mobility is still an issue. As I was first starting this book, Hurricane Katrina came along. We had this really vivid illustration of the ways in which these inequities work. You know, everyone who was left in New Orleans, more than 90% were Black people. And that had to do with the fact that these were mostly not people who didn't own a car. And the city had actually made no plan to get non-car owners out of the city. It had a whole redirect the highways so everyone can drive out system for car owners. And literally on the website, it was like, find a friend with a car. But the thing about, you know, living in an area where people don't own cars, you don't actually have a friend with a car. So this is going to be ongoing. We're also entering a sort of ride-sharing world where there's often prejudice against African Americans and things from Airbnb to Uber to Lyft. So the thing about travel segregation or travel discrimination is it seems to have reinvented itself for new forms of technology and to meet new circumstances. And I think we are still in that era of reinvention.
All right, my questions are coming in, and I've got two that I'll try and combine because they're both about methodology and archives and primary sources.
Okay.
At least as I sit here, it's daunting, and folks can, when they pick up the book, of course, peruse the footnotes. I know we don't always do that, but when you peruse the footnotes, you learn a lot about method and about archives. But I don't guess maybe a version of the question is, you know, what helped you most? How did you determine where you would look and how you would look? And what did you learn about sort of the archives of transportation in researching this book?
Well, I learned that they're enormous. I don't think I could have written this book, you know, without being in the age of the internet, because I had to cast a very wide net. I had to find sort of references to Black drivers and things like automotive magazines and, you know, all sorts of obscure journals about street railways, all sorts of relatively obscure publications, all of which are now kind of Google searchable. You know, I was able to use things like the NAACP papers, just to cast a very wide net and really do a lot of kind of creative searching with creative search terms. I mean, I did things like look for, do word searches that involve like Negro and jalopy, which is like an old word for a car. And that would kind of produce various stories about Black people and cars from a certain generation. So it involved all sorts of different kinds of searches in a very wide net. I don't know if there was a real method to it. It was more like just kind of, you know, a series of questions. Like, you know, for instance, with both the buses and airplanes chapters, there was no real historical literature on these things. So I really had to just ask myself and follow people's journeys. What was it like, you know, when buses came along, when, you know, were African Americans able to use them? C. Vann Woodward had talked about how, you know, segregation moves seamlessly from trains to buses. And I was like, how could that happen? Like how would it, like, it's not an organic phenomenon. So I actually had to kind of break down the story of what's the history of the bus, at what point do they start segregating buses, and how and why does that happen?
So you mentioned Woodward, so maybe that's an opening to ask you more about sort of who are the historians that you are sort of reading, engaging, maybe gently debating around this.
Well, I definitely walked in the shadow of Woodward, and this sort of set of questions he ended up raising about like when and why segregation began, because I feel like almost everyone who has written about it is sort of like either pro or anti Woodward, and
for folks that don't know, like, what's the debate?
Of course. Yes. C. Van Woodward's arguably one of his most famous books is The Strange Career of Jim Crow, which came out in the 50s and is a study of the emergence of the Jim Crow laws, the Jim Crow regime that required separate but equal facilities, that ends up arguing that it wasn't something that emerged right after the Civil War, right with the abolition of slavery. It wasn't a kind of like move from like, okay, these people are enslaved and now they have to be segregated, but instead it takes time to develop, which he interpreted as it wasn't a foregone conclusion. There were more sort of liberal, open, fluid, he used words like that, tendencies that could have gone differently. And then he kind of looks at the 1880s and 1890s as a moment in which segregation emerges out of a particular sort of political moment in Southern politics. None of which is I think the broad outline of his story has a lot of things that people haven't been able to disprove. I think part of what is interesting is studying it through the lens of Black travelers, as you realize what he missed is that this sort of period of fluidity he talked about was really about African Americans having secured certain rights in the aftermath of the Civil War and fighting very hard to hold on to them. So segregation takes a while to come in, but it comes in part because African Americans are actually insisting on occupying space on equal terms. That's sort of one thing I emphasize. And I guess what I feel like I've contributed to the historiography is to kind of move this story out of the purely legal realm. In the book, I'm always very interested in not just what is the law, but what's actually happening on the ground, because a lot of the legal law isn't necessarily honored, or the custom that develops is not the same as the law. So I'm interested in that. And I'm also very interested in what happens post-Plessy. A lot of the really wonderful legal history on travel segregation, like Barbara Welke's book, are mostly talking about sort of before the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which, to remind everybody, is a railroad case. So separate but equal really does get established on the road. And then people are kind of like, and then after that, people just, had to ride in Jim Crow cars. But people, African Americans, do not stop challenging transportation segregation after Plessy, and the fight moves to other forms of transportation than Jim Crow cars.
I'm thinking of the work of Blair Kelly, Right to Ride, which is, I think, about the organizing.
Yes, and one of the key moments, streetcars involve a tremendous battle over segregation that happens after Kelly. So, and I don't deal with streetcars because they're local, but I do kind of, like Blair Kelly, I want to see what continues to happen after Plessy.
Well, the next question wants to ask you about the local. And so you'll tell us what you want. Yeah. But I mean, one way of thinking about the question is, do you think there's a different story if you were to tell it, say, through a city like Baltimore, and to stay in a city like Baltimore? Absolutely. Is it a different kind of story?
I think it's a different type of story, and I think you can see that to some extent in Blair Kelly's wonderful book, Right to Ride. For one, in one city, if you can do something like streetcar segregation, you can actually, and this happens in the Montgomery bus boycott, influence the bottom line of the whoever sort of doing the transportation, like the streetcar companies. You're deep in municipal politics. You have various constituencies on the ground. So it's very much a local struggle that is about local politics, the politics of a particular place. One of the really challenging things about this sort of long distance stuff is it's often kind of an individual who's had a terrible experience and is trying to figure out how to deal with it. And the strategy is different. It's harder. Often what's at stake is less everyday, but can involve more true danger. I mean, there are people who, get beaten to death on buses or thrown off trains. So it's so there's these sort of terrible dangers. And then beyond that, there is, as I was mentioning previously, the ways in which people aren't used to it. So it's very visible to them. I mean, for instance, the journalist Carl Rowan, who grew up in, I think it was Tennessee, but I'm not entirely sure. But he said that, you know, growing up, segregation became sort of invisible to him in his own hometown. He was very used to it. And it wasn't until he left and joined the army that and then came back, that he was like, oh, you know, like this is. So I think that that's part of the ways in which sometimes in the local people kind of make do with the status quo. And those people who don't want to fight it, like you say, are often people who have kind of decided in this particular town to fight it and go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. You're making me think about my own great-grandmother who, great-great-grandmother who was said to have had a buggy and a horse. And so locally, right, in her family, they avoided in Danville, Kentucky, the segregation in transportation because they had a buggy and they could just bypass it. But when they wanted to leave town, right, there they were in the vice grip, right, of segregation. And you can't get from Danville to Cincinnati or to Louisville without having to contend with Jim Crows. I appreciate that. I think that's really interesting for me. So one of our guests here has a comment that I'll share, and then I'll follow with a question. Thanks for touching on this subject. As a Black man, I no longer use Airbnb due to multiple rejections. Experience the same thing using Uber in various parts of the US. When I travel, if it's close enough to drive, I do, and I stay in hotels. So the question is, are you hearing stories like this from people as you're traveling around and talking about the book? I mean, it's almost as if I imagine you could write a whole other book now because are you hearing these 21st century stories that resonate?
I'm absolutely hearing them. I'm also following the emerging studies because all of this stuff is not a matter of individual experience. All the studies of Uber, Airbnb, the other sort of ride sharing economies are showing that, you know, African Americans are getting disproportionately rejected. And you know, it is the sort of same old story. I mean, again, with these services, people initially thought, okay, this is good. Underserved communities will now have great transportation. And I do think that, you know, things like Uber and Lyft for people who have no other options sometimes is an option they didn't have before, but it is not uncommon for Black people to be turned away. And, you know, we're still in the sort of same problem. Recently, I think, both Uber and Lyft have made some commitments to try to kind of police this, but so far I don't think there's much evidence of success.
I have a question from our colleague, Dr. Nadia Nur-Hussain. Welcome, Dr. Nur-Hussain. Glad you're with us. She says, I haven't read the book yet, but I look forward to doing so. Have you thought about, or in fact, did you write about traveling by ship? That probably, I think, is for a lot of us a subject that wouldn't come to mind immediately, but there is the whole matter of traveling by water.
I did not, but I could have, and I thought about doing so. The reason I did not is that in the US, traveling by water is not something people did routinely to travel domestically, and I decided fairly early on that the book was already too big. I couldn't do international travel. But, you know, most of the stories I tell have analogous stories on things like ferries, river boats. And then, of course, many of the people I write about who are sort of complaining about transportation segregation on various forms of land travel, you know, have experiences on ocean liners. So I sort of regret it, but, you know, I feel like there's still a lot of room for a closer study of segregation aboard boats.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about Josephine DeQueer and Hall versus DeQueer, which comes to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1880s.
Absolutely.
And is Josephine DeQueer being excluded from that first-class cabin as she's headed up the Mississippi River. So
yeah, and I talk a little bit about that because that's a very important case in the basic law.
And so it's a great topic out there for those are contemplating senior theses, dissertations, books, and more. So so that's great. There's always room for more excellent work. So another question about the North. Someone who says, I grew up just outside of the New York metropolitan area during the 60s and 70s. And I'm listening to you, and I can see how our areas were and still are underserved by the bus system. There are parkways to the beaches, which were designed purposefully not to accommodate the heights of buses, so that only people with cars could enjoy those areas. And a lot of it still exists. And she said, the questioner says, I share this as people don't tend to think of New York City when they think of segregation.
Yeah, but they probably should, especially, a lot of the design around, creating resort, areas to relax and enjoy yourself, like beaches, amusement parks and stuff. And those that are built in the 60s and even the 50s, they're built for a car culture. And they're cultivating these kind of middle class white, white recreation people, and they often actually take measures to discourage people from the inner city coming in. Those they definitely include not making transportation easily available, and all of it's made worse during the era of urban renewal when to create the interstate municipalities and states lay down highways that often sort of block Black and brown neighborhoods from the main area of the city and sort of complicate the general transportation system. So there's a sort of segregated geography that definitely extends to the northern states.
And as I understand it, this is part of what is animating the way in which the Biden administration is rethinking its role and its influence on infrastructure, right? The literal removing, right, of highways that had long ago either devastated or bifurcated Black communities. But for example, here in Baltimore, we are, it said, going to benefit from the high-speed rail. But I take your point, right, which is even if we get the high-speed rail and a kind of an efficient, it's along these existing lines that leave so many parts of the state and the country sort of out of it when it comes to rail transportation, slow, fast, and otherwise. It really doesn't really speak to the issues that you're raising. Here's a question about social justice movements and Black Lives Matter. And let me try and just embellish it enough to say that I don't think of today as segregated transportation and its legacy to be on the front burner in social movements, thinking a lot about, importantly, about police violence in the carceral state, about voting rights and political rights, political power more generally. Maybe a way to think about the question is sort of, what would your pitch be to, President Biden or Vice President Harris about where we should be aiming to go when it comes to transportation, as we informed by this legacy that you so well documented here?
Well, I think we actually should think about transportation inequalities as central to a lot of current inequalities, and actually central to Black Lives Matter, because the other thing that sort of emerges out of this the car-centered culture we live in is basically takes, all the federal money goes into the highways and supporting a car culture. And for African Americans, it often can be a very damaging car culture a lot of the incidents around which Black matters take shape are around things like traffic stops. And they underscore the ways in which cars have special dangers for African Americans. They're dangers that have existed almost as long as the car, in terms of African Americans being especially subject to the scrutiny of law enforcement while driving. But they've gotten much worse since the Reagan era, because we have a kind of policing in which there, traffic stops looking for drugs, in which people search people's cars, are done widely and indiscriminately and tend to target motorists of color. And that's where you sort of get the situation where you have to have activists out there saying Black Lives Matter. I mean, Sandra Bland. I mean, the list of names goes on. There's a list of them in the book, which then could have additions since the book was published. And it's something that we have to wrestle with as a society, because if you can't create basic safety for people moving through the world, you have sort of gotten nowhere in terms of a society that respects the civil rights of everyone. And I think it is something that people are struggling with at this point. Both activists and hopefully the Biden administration. And part of it will be about, what do we do with transportation? How do we assure everyone a sort of right to travel without putting their life at risk?
I really appreciate that, because thinking about how intertwined these questions are. How can you think about voting rights if you can't get to the polling place?
Exactly.
I feel like question of mobility and transportation runs through all of these issues, but oftentimes I think I don't know how can I put it, not wholly articulated, right? It runs underneath and through. But even your emphasis on how we become clearly a car culture in so many parts of this country, but we don't quite correlate that to then the kind of violence that's enacted on Black travelers and Black drivers, seen that is generated in part by this dependency on the atomized form of transportation, which is the car.
Yeah, and there's even the legal element of, the Fourth Amendment protects your home against search and seizure, but there's an automobile exception which allows traffic stops to take place in which people search your car. And this is sort of part of how a lot of these terrible incidents start, is someone stopping you for it's a pretextual stop. They stop you because maybe you have a taillight out or driving erratically, and then this opens up to all sorts of scrutiny.
So I'm back to other folks' questions. One is about this rubric of the long civil rights movement. And I think I'd be tempted, right, to situate this book as sort of mapping out the long civil rights movement for us, one that begins long before we get to the mid-20th century. Are you someone who's promoting this vision of a long civil rights movement that links together the struggles of the 19th century to the struggles of the 20th and the 21st, or I don't know, how do you think about that?
I mean, I would definitely backdate, the civil rights struggle, virtually back to 1619, right? The long civil rights movement as a phrase comes out of a particular sort of historiographic moment and kind of underscores the early 20th century. But I guess when it comes to travel, at least, I think you could really call it a constant civil rights struggle. I mean, it is a civil rights struggle in which some of the segregation actually comes because African Americans are trying to secure civil rights. So it's sort of it's a dialectic, that has, that sort of it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah. When I was beginning to keep track of the cases I was encountering that was the experience. They kept going further back,
Yeah.
back in time,
Right.
rather than, there's sort of a signal moment,
Right.
when the tension shifts. And I'm sorry, I really appreciate that. So I have just a couple of minutes left, and maybe I thought I'd ask you about the book you're working on now. We'll certainly have you back, and we'll look forward to talking about it more. But I know that you're at the Star Center this year, and you've got time for thinking about this new project and working on it. And so I thought maybe you'd tell us a little bit about your work on Mr. Jefferson and how you came to that, and what we can look forward to.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The work on African-American ideas about Thomas Jefferson that I'm now doing is something I've been curious about a very long time. Back when I was writing my dissertation, which became my first book, The White Image and the Black Mind, and I sort of delved into the world of antebellum Black newspapers for the first time. One of the things that surprised me is, how often they quote Jefferson, refer to him, talk about him, and there really was and is no sort of study of it. So I've been working on that for a long time, and it's been kind of challenging because there was a way in which, when I first started out on this project, Jefferson was a bit of a sacred cow, and what African Americans say about him, while not uniformly critical, is not always filled with praise either. But I've continued on it, and I'm really beginning to see it as something that allows us to think about the ways in which, how do a disenfranchised people struggle to sort of make sense of and perhaps, enlarge the potential of a democracy by engaging with one of its central philosophers, because I think that is part of what it's about. And it's about doing it also at a point where, the nation is a republic for the first time, and part of what African Americans are dealing with is how to reformulate struggles to deal with a different regime than they experienced under the British, like a different political structure, a different way of thinking about governance, and how to do so just to make sort of bold claims, which I think they often make around some of Thomas Jefferson's ideas, but they also use him to critique the ways in which the founding fathers don't kind of live up to their ideals.
We look forward to it, and it sounds like a book that will be deeply relevant as we approach 2026 and the U.S. at 250. And I think our appetite for understanding the so-called founders, but your ability, I think, to bring us the founders from the vantage point of Black Americans, if I could say, is very much in the spirit of the work that we're doing here in the lab, which is to ask questions that have been asked and answered before, and forgive our construction next door, but to take a deliberate point of view on that. So we look forward to it, and we will invite you back, and thank you to our neighbors. So with that, I get to hand it over to you. Thank you for bringing us out, and thank you again, Dr. Bay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bay, for this incredibly rich conversation. We're honored to have had you here with us today. And we appreciate how your research sheds light on the questions that we're asking here at the Hard Histories at Hopkins project. For me, prior to this work, I never really critically contemplated travel and the experience of travel. Like, as a 20th century historian, I think of, post-emancipation, the possibilities for Black movement. But even thinking about some of the Great Migration, we talk about people's experience post getting there, but not their experiences to get there. So it adds new dimensions to my study of Black American history, and I'm so appreciative for that. And thank you to our audience for watching and for sending in your great questions, and to the team at SNF Agora Institute for their support for this event.